This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are interviewing the head of Machon Shiloh, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rav Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
We hear about a proposed political solution to advance peace between Israel and the Palestinians, of two states for two peoples, whereby a Palestinian state would be created. From a moral vantage point, from a vantage point of advancing justice and peace in the world, don't the Palestinian people deserve self-determination?
The premise of your question is the problem. Your assumption is that there is a Palestinian people. And this is a myth, simply an untruth, an invention. Historically, there has never been a Palestinian people except for the Jewish people who were the people of Palestine. In order to explain what I'm saying, let us backtrack nearly 2,000 years to the year 135, according to the Christian calendar, when the Roman authorities, at the time of Hadrian, in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, renamed the land of Israel, or that province of the Roman Empire known as Judea. They renamed it Syria, Palestine. They combined part of what is today Syria and the Galil and the area known as Yehuda, that had been known as Yehuda till that time, and they renamed it Syria, Palestine, or simply Palestine. This was part of the attempt on the part of the Romans to subjugate, to persecute, to weaken the Jewish people's resolve, to destroy their national identity, and to take the sting out of Jewish nationalism, so to speak, which had caused the Romans much trouble because the Jews had never accepted Roman rule over their country and over themselves. So the land of Israel, or Judea, was renamed Palestine, which of course comes from the term used already in the Bible of Peleshet. Peleshet referred to the area in which the Philistines, the Pelishtim, lived, and that term was revived by the Romans for this political purpose. And the people of Palestine, therefore, were the Jews. These were the people who had always inhabited this part of the world, and therefore they also became known as Palestinians. And in fact, till very recent times, till the Ottoman-Turkish period, the turn of the 20th century, and even well into the British Mandate period during the 20th century, the word Palestinian referred to people who lived in this country, and many Jews were referred to as Palestinians and had official documents, travel papers, passports, etc., which referred to their nationality as Palestinian. That is number one. Number two, there has been an immense and very well orchestrated cover-up of the historical facts, because from the early part of the 19th century, Jews began returning to their homeland in ever-increasing numbers. It should be mentioned that this is not to say that the country was empty of Jews. In fact, Eretz Yisrael was never empty of Jews. There was always a Jewish presence in this country, literally from time immemorial and up until the present day. There were, of course, ups and downs for different reasons. For example, the period in the wake of the First Crusade, we're talking about the 12th century, etc., 12th, 13th century, there was a distinct drop in the number of Jewish inhabitants in the Jewish homeland, and yet there was always a Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael, and has been for the last 3,500 years. Nevertheless, it's a fact, as we all know, that the Jewish people were driven into exile starting at the time of the destruction of the Temple and Jerusalem, in the year 70 by the Romans at the time of the Great Revolt. And even though there was a very large Jewish presence after that for many hundreds of years, that was the beginning of a process of emigration by Jews to other countries because of the policy of the Romans, which was to persecute the Jews both financially and religiously, etc. Starting around the beginning of the 19th century, as we said, Jews began returning in ever-increasing numbers to the land of Israel, which was at that time part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The country was to a large extent desolate, as depicted very precisely and aptly by Mark Twain, who visited the country in the early part of the 19th century. He describes the desolation, the emptiness of the country, basically bereft of inhabitants, how one could travel large distances without seeing a soul or just a handful of individuals in the fields or on the roads. And this from the mouth of Mark Twain, not a Jew with an agenda, so to speak. The Jews returned to their homeland, their ancient homeland, to which they had always been attached. Jews throughout history had always maintained this connection with the land of Israel. And of course they began to build the country economically and in every other way. So that by the mid-19th century, and certainly from about 1870 onwards, the progress that was evident in the country in terms of building an economic base and prosperity, etc., was causing many Arabs and Arabic-speaking, but not necessarily Arabs, people from places as far away as Armenia and the Caucasus, etc., but Arabic-speaking individuals, to come to this country because of the economic opportunities. Many of these people, of these Arab and Arabic-speaking people from the surrounding countries such as, or those areas today known as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the Sudan, Egypt, Lebanon, etc., and even places further afield. Many of these people had been dispossessed because of extortionate taxation and other government measures and general economic depression, and they came to this country in order to find work, very simply. It is a story of economic prosperity and opportunity, drawing and encouraging immigration. This is a pattern which is repeated throughout history, and the same thing happened here. And the simple fact of the matter is that the majority of the so-called Arab Palestinian people today are the descendants of such immigrants from surrounding countries that came to the land of Israel as a result, as a direct result of the Jewish return to its homeland and the building up of the land and the economic opportunities which this provided. This fact, or these facts, were laid down in a book quite a number of years ago by an American journalist by the name of Joan Peters, a non-Jewish woman, again without any particular agenda. In fact, she herself describes at the beginning of her book how she began to research this subject from the opposite position. She accepted the so-called Arab-Palestinian narrative, and she rapidly discovered, however, as a result of very serious and diligent, in-depth research which she conducted in British archives and other sources which were either unavailable to other writers on the subject or who simply had not bothered to check. She discovered that all this myth was a myth. The concept of a Palestinian Arab nation, a people that had lived here from time immemorial, was simply a myth. And I'd like to quote to you briefly from this book. This is the book to which I refer, From Time Immemorial, by Joan Peters. This book was first published in 1984. As you can see, this is an immense volume with literally thousands of references and notes and direct quotes from government papers, reports, British Mandate, and before that as well, although the documentation of the Turkish Ottoman Empire ranges from unreliable to non-existent. So much of this material is based on British Mandate records. I'll just give you a couple of examples. First of all, on page 270 of this book, she writes that when she spoke to a 30-year veteran, an archivist in the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office records in London, and she asked for assistance in finding records on immigration to Palestine, this person, this archivist, led briskly to the varied references on Jewish immigration and to the general immigration category, under which all the headings that indicated Jews' arrival were to be found. When asked what of Arab immigration, he responded, and I quote, "Arab immigration into Palestine? Why, it did not exist. There was no such thing," he scoffed. "No one ever kept track of that." On the very same page, the author, Joan Peters, quotes from an official report from January 3rd, 1926, in which a British colonial clerk, official, writes, "So long as the Hawran is an area which is today in Syria, which was outside the British Mandate area called Palestine, so long as the Hawrana neighborhood remained disturbed, it is agreed that refugees who would appear to be Syrian, Lebanese, or Palestinian by nationality may be admitted into Palestine without passport or visa." In other words, during that period and for many years, it was accepted policy of it was the standard policy of the British regime here in the land of Israel to allow Arabs and Arabic-speaking peoples to enter the country without hindrance. The only immigration that they bothered to record and to be diligent in controlling and very often limiting was Jewish immigration. I will quote another couple of lines from this book. The Hope-Simpson report of 1930, which by itself substantially contributed to the myth of displaced and landless Arabs being displaced by Jewish immigration, in that very same report there is mention of the following. This is quoted in the book From Time Immemorial on page 297, and this is a direct quote from the Hope-Simpson report. It speaks of Egyptian labor being employed, that is to say Egyptian workers entering the country, very often illegally, and being employed here both by the Mandate and by Jews and by others, and then remaining in the country. It goes on to speak of unemployment lists being swollen by immigrants from Transjordania, illicit immigration through Syria and across the northern frontier of Palestine is material. These are just a few examples of what was actually happening during those years. In short, the Arab population of the land of Israel today is, for the most part, the result of deliberate policy both by the Ottoman Empire, which in its attempt to repopulate the country, which Mark Twain had described as being desolate and empty, the Turks brought immigrants from places in Turkey and Armenia and the Caucasus, as we mentioned before. And later, due to the economic boom caused by the Jewish return to the land of Israel, many Arabs and Arabic-speaking peoples returned rather, I should say, came to the country in order to find jobs and opportunities of an economic sort. And from this was formed the myth of a Palestinian people. The fact is that there is no Palestinian people. There is no distinct Palestinian history. There is no distinct Palestinian language or literature or religion, which of course gives lie to the interesting fact that we all should note, and that is that in certain circles in the world today, it is claimed that the Jewish people should not have a country of their own. They do not need a state because we live in a global world and there's no reason for such nation states, etc. If you think about it, it's rather amusing. On the other hand, it's also diabolical, but it's rather amusing as well, because what these people in fact are saying, that the group of people in the world, that is to say the Jewish people, who are more of a nation than any other nation one can point to on this planet, are people who can demonstrate a continuous and historically viable, vibrant and meaningful existence as a nation for 4,000 years, with its own language, religion, literature and history. That nation, that group of people, does not require a state, according to these left-wing anti-Semites who hide behind their false claims of anti-Zionism. But the mythical fantasy, the invention known as the Palestinian people, who have no history, no literature, no language, they, for some reason, require a state. And that really says it all.